The dog led him through the snowstorm. But what it found wasn't a corpse. It was a curse yet to be broken. The wind drove the snow in wild, swirling sheets across the high plains, rattling the sod-roofed cabin like 1,000 tapping fingers. John Rourke woke with a start, the chill of early morning seeping through the thin log walls, as though the storm itself had breached his defenses. His faithful dog Dusty lay beside him one moment, and the next was tugging violently at his sleeve teeth, clamping into canvas with enough force to draw blood. John yanked the lantern free of its hook, the flame sputtering as he swung it toward the dog, whose eyes glowed silver in its light. Outside, the wind moaned and groaned, but beneath it, John heard something else faint. Desperate, a human sound carried half-hidden on the gale. Dusty yanked again, pulling John to his feet and toward the door. He slid on thick boots and snatched up his rifle, the barrel cold against his palm. As he stepped into the blizzard, the lantern's glow revealed a landscape of pure white, all semblance of color erased by wind and snow. Dusty bounded ahead, weaving through drifts almost as tall as the dog itself, nose to the ground. John trudged after him, each step an effort against the storm's fierce resistance. The dog's yelps grew louder, more urgent, until at last they reached the forest's edge. Among the tangled pines, their trunks bent and scarred by some long-past fire, John spotted a dark shape half covered by fresh snow. He hurried forward and dropped to his knees, brushing frigid flakes from what turned out to be a young woman. Her body was limp, her dark hair fanned around her head like a sodden halo. She was shivering violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her wrists bound so tightly with coarse rope that the fibers had cut deep into her flesh. John worked quickly, fingers numb, ripping the knots and freeing her arms. When he turned her face toward him, she moaned ice crystals, whisking from her lips like smoke. He wrapped his buffalo hide coat around her and slung her across his shoulder. Dusty pressed close, whining, as John forced his way back through the wind toward the cabin whose walls promised heat and safety. Inside the hearth, fire bled warmth into the cramped room. John laid the woman on the narrow bunk reserved for visitors, though few ever stayed, and propped her head with a coil of his own blankets. He poured a small cup of whiskey into hot coffee and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, then collapsed into silence. As she drifted in and out of fevered half-sleep, John noticed a mark carved into the oak beam above her head, a circle of flame with a single flickering tongue rising from its center. The carving was fresh sap, oozing from the groove and freezing in delicate icicles. It glowed in the lamplight, a warning none too subtle. He crouched to examine her injuries. Her back was striped with crimson scars, the cruel lash of a whip, and on her left wrist was a half-formed tattoo. The unmistakable silhouette of a scorpion. It told John more than any words could have. This was the living judgment, the brand of exile, the Apache reserved for those cast out of their own people. But as he gently probed her arms for other harm, he wondered what crime could be worse than leaving a woman bound and broken in a frozen wilderness. The thought turned his stomach, and he shoved it away. He didn't question who she had been to her tribe, only whether she deserved the same fate. Morning light filtered weakly through frost-cracked window panes, burning away the last of the night's charcoal shadows. The storm had spent itself, leaving the world bright and blinding. John brought the woman dry clothes, fresh rations of salted venison, and hardtack, and more of the coffee and whiskey tonic. She ate like someone starved for more than food. And when he slipped her coat from her shoulders, he saw that she clutched something at her waist. He eased a hand beneath her thin dress to withdraw a small leather pouch stitched with sinew and worn by travel. Inside lay two objects that made his breath catch a fragment of a hand-torn parchment singed at the edges, and a chain of silver wolf teeth, each engraved with a symbol he did not recognize. John held up the map fragment, spreading it gingerly on the table. Faint red lines traced a rugged mountain range. A blood-red X marked a spot deep within the forest beyond his cabin. The torn edge of the parchment looked jagged, as if ripped in haste, and the burnt margins suggested someone had tried to destroy it. The wolf teeth chain gleamed in the pale light, its craftsmanship unlike any trinket he had ever seen. Chilled though she was, the woman's hand twitched at the edge of the table, fingers curling around the edge of the chain. Her eyes opened then, wide, haunted, and fixed on the necklace, as though its metal held her very soul. She whispered something in Apache that sent a shiver down John's spine. Through the haze of sleep, he thought he heard the phrase again and again. "The fire is seeking me." Fire was sacred to Apache lore, an element both purifier and destroyer. If she spoke of a fire that hunted her, then something terrible was indeed at work. He laid a hand over hers, and when she looked at him, her dark eyes were filled with both fear and recognition. He nodded, though he wished he understood more. He could feel the weight of her story, the agony she carried, and he knew he could not send her back into the wilderness to die. He spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin. He pounded extra planks across the windows, piled more wood beside the hearth, and restocked his oil lamp. Dusty lay by the fire, but watched John constantly nose twitching, as though he smelled company or danger on the wind. John himself felt as though he were marking time, awaiting something yet unseen. Memories of his own past flickered at the edges of his mind, his sister Emily wrongly accused and condemned to hang for a crime she did not commit. He remembered the verdict, the judge's smug face, the roar of the crowd, as the trap door released her, and his own reaction standing up in the gallery, rifle in hand, shooting the judge, the prosecutor, and the hangman before the law could stop him. 5 years in jail for murder, and yet he had returned to this same land, an exile among white men, with a scar deeper than any brand across his soul. He would not let another woman die unjustly, not if he could help it. That night, the woman Amaya John would come to know stirred again. The lantern's light danced across her pale face as she murmured in her sleep, repeating that ominous phrase. John sat close, gun across his knees, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin. Outside, the wind rasped at the door, but the real threat John suspected was much closer than the storm. He thought of the boot prints he'd seen by the burned tree outside Heavy Tread, pressed hard into the mud beneath the snow, and wondered who had trailed her here. Men cold enough to leave her to freeze, or worse, had marked the path to whatever lay hidden at the heart of the blood-red forest. In the morning, he found Amaya awake, her eyes open, but distant. He brought her water and more food. She accepted both without speaking, until John placed the pouch and its contents on the table between them. At that, she stiffened. Her gaze shifted from the wolf teeth to the map fragment, and tears welled in her eyes. She spoke then in accented English, so halting he had to lean close to hear. "They will come for what I carry." She traced the map with a trembling finger. "This is half of what they seek. The wolf teeth." She swallowed hard. "They will find me if I don't lead them." John nodded once. He did not ask her who they were or why she had the map. He understood enough. The world beyond was dangerous, and she carried something powerful enough to kill for. He reached for his coat and belt, buckling the revolver in place. Dusty greeted him with a wagging tail and a bright, eager bark. The dog knew there was movement in the wind, knew danger was afoot. John heard it in his own blood. He hoisted his pack, canned beef spare whiskey rope knife, and turned back to the bunk. Amaya sat up and pressed the pouch into his hand. "Keep it safe," she said softly. "It will guide you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it held a quiet authority that made him catch his breath. She stood swayed, then leaned on him for support. He helped her into the thick coat he had brought her, tightening it around her shoulders, until she looked almost as much a part of the frozen world outside as the trees themselves. Then, with no more words, she took Dusty's collar in one hand and John's rifle in the other, and together, the three of them, stepped into the swirling snow. The forest loomed ahead, its pines blackened at the base, their bark streaked red as though bleeding sap. The ruins of an old mining road wound between them, half buried by drifts leading deeper into the heart of the bloodwood forest. The wind tore at John's scarf, stinging his face, but he pressed on boots, crunching in the powder. Amaya moved beside him, her eyes on the torn map, the wolf teeth chain hidden beneath her coat. Dusty padded ahead, nose low alert to every scent. John's heart pounded as he followed her through the towering pines. He thought of the fireplace in his cabin, of the warmth he'd left behind. But he did not look back. Redemption, he decided, was not found by hiding in safety. It lay somewhere ahead, amid the rust-red trees and frozen shadows. He would share her burden, protect whatever secret the map and the chain concealed, even if it meant facing the fire that sought her. Snow fell harder, blurring the path, turning every ridge and hollow into a silver expanse. Yet with each step John took, he felt the weight of his past lighten, replaced by a fierce determination. He might have been guilty once in the eyes of the law and in his own, but here in the howling wilderness, he had the chance to do right. He vowed silently to the woman at his side and the loyal dog in front that he would see this through. Nothing, not storm, nor man, nor myth, would stop him from uncovering the truth in those blood-red woods, even if it meant confronting the flames themselves. The first 6 days passed in a hush that weighed more heavily than any storm. Every dawn, John Rourke rose before the pale sun fed the horses, refilled the wood box by the hearth, and checked on the nameless girl. By midday, he would stir a stew of dried venison and beans over the cast-iron stove, letting its savory steam fill the cramped cabin. Always, she would be slumped on the bunk, eyes closed, skin pale, but growing firmer against the fever's retreat. He'd set a bowl at her feet, whispering, "Eat, sister," though of course she would not answer. Each evening, as the fire's glow turned the walls amber, he'd press warm compresses to the bruises on her back, their reddened lines zigzagging like wounded branches. She never cried out, never flinched. She might have been carved of wood, save for the faint tremor in her shoulders that belied her silence. In those long, wordless days, John learned to read every minute of her behavior. He noted how her chest rose and fell in slow arcs, how her lips, even when still, tightened at the corners, as though warding off pain. He watched her fingers twine the corner of the blanket whenever he approached, felt the sudden flinch whenever he drew too near. At night, he lay awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards, as Dusty shifted his bulk by the hearth, the whistle of wind through the chinks in the logs, and always just beneath it, a faint, dry whisper. At first, he thought it was the cabin settling, but then he realized it was her murmuring in her sleep. A single phrase repeated over and over, intoned in a language he could not understand. Apache, he guessed, from the snap of consonants and the lilt of vowels. The words sounded like water hissing over stones. The fire. The fire. They follow the fire. He tried to catch more of it by leaning close to her bunk, but the moment his breath stirred the air above her, she would clench her eyes shut tighter, and the whispering would cease. For all his kindly ministrations, clean bandages, steaming broth, protective prayers, he muttered under his breath. She treated him as an intruder, a necessary but unwelcome guardian. John had never met a woman who could refuse him so completely without a single spoken word. He was used to being feared or loathed in towns, but here alone in the wilderness, his reputation as a killer had felt distant, almost academic. Yet in her silent stoicism, he sensed deeper wounds than those left by whips or ropes. She'd been pulled through hell, and those 6 nights were her purgatory. By the 3rd night, he was haunted by her silence. He found himself imagining what she might say, if she could speak the stories she might tell, of captivity, of betrayal, of hope. He recalled his own nightmares of his sister Emily's face contorted with fear as the rope closed around her neck, the final convulsions of her breath as the hangman's knot cut tight. That guilt, his guilt, had prompted him to rescue this girl, to bring her into the light of his cabin, but it also made him respect the magnitude of her loss. She had lost her freedom, her family, perhaps her faith in any savior. How could he blame her for withholding her words? On the 4th day, he cleaned the firebox and swept the hearth until the ashes gleamed pale gray. He draped fresh deerskins over the bunk and boiled sage in a pot to fumigate the air. It was then he noticed for the first time in daylight the strange tattoo on the nape of her neck. Flicking back the strands of dark hair he found burned deep into the flesh. The numbers 47B circled twice in black charcoal. His breath caught. That combination, 47 letter B, had the look of a prisoner's mark. He recalled stories of labor camps in New Mexico where convicts were branded like cattle. The B indicate a cell block. The numbers an inmate's code. It meant she'd been captured caged, forced into labor, in a place where silver was torn from rock and bones left unburied. John felt a surge of anger. He thought of the camps he'd heard about, miners' camps, where Apache prisoners were worked to death in shafts deep beneath the earth, their mothers left to mourn on cold reservation flats. He remembered a newspaper clipping he'd read as a boy. Native men and women shackled, their spirits broken, sent to dig out riches that would feed the machines of white men's profit. He wondered if she'd been one of them, if she'd lost her voice to lashings worse than any tree scar. That evening, while grinding coffee beans and letting the hot brew steep, John stared at the tattoo through the kitchen window, its black circle stark against her pale flesh. He thought about the wolf-tooth chain she'd wrapped around his wrist. The night before, a talisman she'd pressed it said it was both key and shield. He held the chain in his palm now and traced the tiny engravings on each tooth, curious but respectful. The symbols seemed to form part of a code, each rune like a piece of a hidden script. The wolf's tooth to native people might represent protection guidance, the spirit of a fierce predator who moved between worlds. If the teeth were the key, then the map fragment torn and burned was the cipher. They fit together, he was certain, but fit to what end he could not yet fathom. On the 5th night, as the fire's embers flared low and Dusty curled at his feet, John sat at the table and drank from a canteen of whiskey, mulling over his next move. The cabin was warm but claustrophobic. The storm outside had left the trails blanketed impassable until the wind shifted. He'd thought to rest for only a night to gather supplies and press on, but her condition had slowed him. Now he felt trapped by circumstance and conscience both. The map fragment with its half-truth taunted him. He had no idea where the other half lay, nor whether following what he had could lead to salvation or ruin. Yet despite all this, she remained silent. That silence, more than the scars on her back or the prison mark on her neck, gnawed at him. The nights when she whispered in Apache, clutching at her dreams, he saw in her face not just fear, but a flicker of longing, as though language itself, once lost, might be reclaimed in those fevered mutterings. John realized he needed to coax her voice back. He needed to show her that speech was safe here, that no lariat or branding iron awaited on the other side of her tongue. On the 6th morning, he broke routine. Instead of tending the hearth first, he placed a fresh quilt across the bunk and knelt beside her. She lay still, eyes closed, but when he spoke her name, Amaya, he'd decided her eyelids fluttered. He laid a finger on her palm. "Amaya," he said softly, "you're safe." Her hand tightened for a moment, though her face remained impassive. He drew out the leather pouch again and set it on her chest. "This map," he said, "it will take us somewhere. I believe it leads to what you seek. But we cannot go until you tell me what you know." He paused, willing her to respond. The only answer came from the wind rattling the chimney. He straightened, then determination setting in his jaw. "Very well," he muttered. "I'll give you until sundown. Then we go with or without your words." He turned away to stoke the fire, but when he glanced back, her eyes were open, fixed on the map. Perhaps she had heard him. Night fell with a hush, as though the forest itself held its breath. Amaya slept fitfully, her brow furrowed, lips parted. John sat in a rocker by the fire, shifting logs into place, and tried to piece together a plan. He would need horses' supplies, a guide. Even if she could walk, the journey into the mountains would be perilous. He'd encountered outlaws, rattlesnake pits, and avalanches in his day, and that was before the forest's own terrors. Could any worldly danger compare to the one that hunted Amaya? He thought of the phrase she whispered, "the fire. They follow the fire. Fire as a being, something alive, sentient, seeking her out to consume her." Then, at the precise moment when the last ember sank into ash, Amaya stirred. She sat up naked in the firelight, save for the blanket drawn around her shoulders. Her eyes, dark and liquid, glowed with a sudden intensity. John startled to his feet, hand flying to the rifle at his belt. Her lips moved, and he leaned in, straining to catch her English. "They come," she whispered, voice raw as flint. "They want the chain, the map." She swallowed as though the words themselves were poison. "They burned my kin. They marked me. They will burn me too." Her breath came quick now. "I was taken to the silver mines. Cell block 47B. I was 14 years old." John felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. The tattoos, the marks, the scars, they were all pieces of her story. He crouched beside her, gently prying the blanket aside to see the tattoo at her nape and the lash marks on her back. She winced, but did not pull away. "They called me thief, traitor, but I did not steal. I only carried what was mine." She tapped the wolf teeth chain at her neck. This belonged to my grandfather. He led our people, the Apache of the Iron Mountains, before the white men came. He hid our treasure silver, yes, but also our history, our faith in a place they still seek. They follow me because I hold the key. John's mind raced. The map fragment showed a ravine that matched the Iron Mountains ridge west of here. The X lay in an area scarred by old mining shafts long since collapsed. Beneath those shafts lay the hidden vaults where her people had buried artifacts and ingots to keep them from profiteers' hands. Every ounce of silver staked to the earth here was soaked in blood. Apache blood. Convict blood. White man's blood. No wonder someone had burned the map and half destroyed it. And no wonder Amaya's captors had tried to brand her, break her will. He scooped up the pouch and flipped over the torn edge of parchment, holding it to the firelight. The scorch marks were crisp. The tear looked deliberate, as if someone had wanted only half the instructions to survive. He traced the array of symbols on the wolf teeth, noticing now they aligned with Map's little glyphs, each tooth's rune matching a contour line, a stream, bed, a cave mouth. They were the missing legends, the cipher that would allow safe passage through the old mining tunnels where trapdoors and pitfalls still lurked. Without them, the map was a death warrant. Amaya's eyes met his, fierce and pleading. "I can guide you," she said, "but you must trust me." Her gaze fell to the rifle at his side, to Dusty's low growl by the hearth. John nodded slowly, his own trust earned over those 6 silent days. He reached out to take her hand. The chain of wolf's teeth lay between their palms, a living bridge between 2 worlds. He gave it a gentle squeeze. "We ride at first light," he said softly. "You'll tell me what I need to know." She nodded, and at last her voice broke into the night. The fire is not a beast, but a promise. It will reclaim what was stolen. Her whisper echoed in the cabin like a vow. John leaned back, exhaling a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged with purpose. He knew the journey ahead would test every skill he possessed, tracking, shooting fortitude. But for the first time since his sister's hanging, he felt something akin to hope. Not just for himself, but for Amaya and for the land itself. They would follow the blood-red forest's edge, weave through the old mining corridors, face those who had stolen Apache silver and dignity alike. And if the map and the chain were true keys, then they would unlock more than a hidden vault. They would open the door to justice for those who had known only suffering in the earth's cold dark. Long after Amaya drifted into a dreamless sleep, John sat by the dying coals, polishing bullets and mentally packing his saddlebags. Dawn would come soon, and with it the next chapter of their journey. But for the first time he felt no dread of what lay beyond the cabin door. He felt instead readiness tempered by caution, guided by a silent oath to protect this broken girl who had finally found her voice. And though the fire that sought her would no doubt blaze hotter still, he vowed so long as he breathed, he would be the shield between her and that hungry flame. 50 riders thundered into the little frontier town just after dawn, their horses' hooves drumming a warning on the packed earth of the main street. They rode in 2 columns, the lead men clad in dusty but well-cut long coats of black and indigo, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Behind them streamed raw-boned cowboys with rifles slung over their shoulders, and still behind a clutch of stocky mulatto gunslingers, with glints of brass on belts and pistols. At their head sat a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored duster of midnight blue, a trench coat brought down from New Orleans, who surveyed the town with an air of possession. His name was Laurent Duval, a financier turned mine magnate, whose investments in the old Apache silver vein had made him both wealthy and dangerous. He leaned forward in his saddle, and as his men fanned out to block side streets and corral the townsfolk into clusters, he raised a hand and called out, Where is John Rourke? Where is the girl who stole from my property?" A hush fell over the crowd. The sheriff, a nervy man with a mottled face and shaking hands, stepped forward from the doorway of the small jail. "Now, Mr. Duval," he stammered, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." Duval cut him off with a cold laugh. "There's no misunderstanding. We know she's in Rourke's cabin, and we know she's the same Indian wretch who escaped custody from the mines. She's a thief, a murderer, and a runaway. Hand her over, and I'll let this town keep its stores, its women, its peace. Refuse, and I'll burn on every building from the saloon to the schoolhouse." The sheriff's hand twitched toward a revolver at his hip. Behind him, townspeople exchanged fearful glances. The butcher stared at his hanging carcasses, in dread of losing both payment and life, while the blacksmith hovered by his open shop, a hammer in one hand and a chisel in the other. Up on the ridge beyond the settlement, John Rourke sat astride his horse, surveying the scene through his binoculars, an old boat spyglass he'd once purchased in New Orleans. Beside him stood Amaya, tall and resolute, in the saddle, the wolf-tooth chain glinting beneath her shawl. She had told him in no uncertain terms that these riders would be coming, that Duval would stop at nothing to reclaim what he called his lost silver. John's jaw was set in a line of iron. He nudged his horse forward and rode down the slope alone, dust kicking up behind him. He dismounted in front of the mob of soldiers of fortune, holstered his rifle, and called out Laurent Duval. Duval stiffened, surprised that Rourke would address him by name. Rourke did not wait for a greeting. "You'll not touch her," he said. "She's under my protection." Duval spat into the dirt. "Protection. You call harboring a fugitive protection. She's wanted for theft. She stole from my mine, and for killing 2 guards during her escape. I have the warrant signed by the district judge himself." He waved a parchment with a gold seal. John glanced at it, then slipped it into his coat pocket without reading. "I've no quarrel with your lawsuits," he said quietly, voice carrying across the hushed street. "But I'll not hand her over to be lynched in a canyon or shackled in your mining camp. If you want to fight, take your men to my ranch. But leave this town out of it." A murmur went through the crowd. The name Rourke carried weight. He'd once killed 3 men in a vigilante court to avenge his sister's wrongful execution, and folks still spoke of it in hushed tones. Duval sneered. "You're bluffing." He nodded to his men. Instantly, rifles swung up barrels pointing at John and Amaya. The townsfolk gasped, some dropping to the ground in panic. John's hand hovered over his sidearm, but he remained still. "Wait," a voice called, and from the edge of the crowd stepped a bent old man, draped in buffalo robes, leaning on a carved wooden staff, crowned by a corroded silver medallion. His skin was deeply creased, voice low, but clear. "Laurent Duval. You know not what you threaten." Duval laughed scornfully. "Speak up, medicine man, or step aside before I make you." The old man raised both hands, staff held out like a banner. "I speak as one who lived under your father's roof," he said, "and who watched your greed consume that land." The crowd parted with a whisper as the old man pushed forward. John recognized him by the iron-black hair and the clan tattoos on his gaunt forearms. Redbird, the medicine man, of the nearby reservation. Everyone knew that Redbird had once served as chief of the Iron Mountains band of Apache before the government confined his people. Now he spoke with the authority of the tribe's elder. "That girl," he said, pointing to Amaya, "is the granddaughter of our late chief and my sister's child, stolen when she was but a babe and sold to your mining interests. The map she carries is not a map to your silver, but to the land deed held in trust for her birthright. You seek to plunder our ancestors' graves, not reclaim lost fortune." A hush fell. Duval's men shifted uneasy. The sheriff frowned at Duval, his faint loyalty to law warring with his fear of Duval's wrath. Duval's eyes narrowed, and his hand twitched toward his rifle. But Red Bird advanced another step. "Look upon this witness," he said, brandishing the silver chain. "Each tooth bears the seal of my forefathers. If you fire upon her now, you spill more than blood. You spill the honor of every man here." He turned to the townsfolk. "Will you stand by and watch the old promises broken? Will you let the white man's law ruin the promise of blood and kinship?" A few of the men in the crowd mumbled their names, then stepped forward, placing themselves behind John's back. The blacksmith headed back to his forge returned with a hammer in hand, as though ready for war. The butcher hefted a cleaver. The barkeep tucked a shotgun behind the bar. Duval saw his advantage slipping away. He spat again, fury burning behind his gray eyes. "You've made your choice, Rourke," he snarled. "Now stand aside, or I'll clear the street." He snapped his fingers, and a half-dozen riflemen raised their weapons. A shot rang out then, high above the fray. Dusty, overlooking from a rooftop, barked once and wagged his tail, then dropped the rifle out of John's rifleman's hand. The weapon clattered uselessly. Guns returned to their holsters. Duval's men stared at each other, uncertain. Your dog," Duval began, but John stepped forward, hands open. "Enough blood has been spilled today," he said. "This town is not your battleground." A tense silence stretched as Duval weighed his options. He glanced at the sheriff, who shook his head slightly. The sheriff spat a curse under his breath, removed Duval's warrant envelope from his coat, and ripped it into two. "I'm done footing your losses, Duval," he said. "This town's done aiding your pursuit." Behind him, the townsfolk raised a cheer, a raw, defiant roar that echoed through the canyon walls. Duval's shoulders slumped, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. He wheeled his horse and signaled his men. Without a word, they filed back into their ranks and rode out, dust plumes trailing behind them. When the last rider disappeared over the ridge, John released a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Amaya slid from her horse and fell into his arms. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks as she whispered words of gratitude in English, broken by emotion. Thank you, John." He held her close, feeling her tremble against him. The wolf-tooth chain pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. Redbird approached, nodding at John and Amaya in respect. "The path ahead," he said, "now belongs to her and to you. I will guide you when you are ready." At that, he turned and walked back toward the reservation staff, tapping against rocks and sagebrush. John watched him go, then looked around at the people gathering up their tools and nerves. The blacksmith replaced his hammer. The butcher hung up his cleaver. The barkeep closed the saloon door. The town was bruised but unbroken. John Rourke mounted Dusty's back and helped Amaya into the saddle beside him. He looked once more at the clearing where Duval's riders had threatened their lives. Now it lay empty, bathed in golden afternoon light. He turned his horse eastward toward the mountains, and the half-map still burning in Amaya's mind. 50 men might have come to take her, but only one heart had stood beside her. And as they trotted out of town, John felt the fierce pride of a man who had chosen his cause and won. The journey ahead would test them further, but they would face it together under the watchful eye of the blood-red forest and the promise of reclaimed justice. A wild November gale descended on the bloodwood forest, like an avenging demon, tearing at pines, scarred red by ancient sap, and tossing snow in suffocating drifts. Far beyond the half-buried mining road, where they'd paused to rest, John Rourke and Amaya had taken counsel with Red Bird at dawn, fashioning crude barricades and setting simple traps of tangled brush, ringed with tinder and ribbons of cloth soaked in whiskey. Now, as the wind's thunderous roar drove them back to the clearing around the cabin, John could see plumes of smoke curling over the ridge. Duval's hired guns were coming for them. 50 rifles. 50 cold hearts. John strapped his rifle butt to his thigh, checked the hammer, and glanced at Amaya, who knelt beside the foxhole they'd dug. She was calm, her wolf-tooth chain glinting against the dark cloak she wore. In the whirling snow, her eyes shone fierce with determination. "Remember," John hissed against the storm. "Wait until they're tangled in the underbrush, then light it." He held up a torch bound in pitch. Through the white glare, he could see movement helmets, silhouettes of horses, the glint of steel. Duval's riders advanced in loose skirmish lines, scanning for signs of life. Any moment now, they would stumble into the snare. Amaya rose, brushed the snow from her cloak, and pressed a hand on his shoulder. No words passed between them. No time. Together they sprinted back toward the burn-scored trees where they'd laid lines of whiskey-soaked cloth across fallen logs, bridging the gaps between stump and root. The first of Duval's men, a rangy fellow with a black mustache, followed Dusty's barking and plunged into the trap. His horse reared, lashing out with hooves, throwing rider and mount into the briars. A torch in John's hand flickered under the wind. Amaya drew her own and touched it to the soaked cloth. A sudden whoosh, a red flare, and flames leapt 10 feet high, hungrily devouring the whiskey trail. Sparks whipped into the air like fireflies gone mad. The scent of burned resin and charred pine cut through the storm's odorless swirl. The trap snapped shut behind the first 20 men, horse and rider alike shrieking as black smoke swallowed them. Rifle cracks pierced the inferno. John rolled clear of the flames, scanning with narrowed eyes. Duval's horsemen were retreating in confusion, spurring their mounts around the blazing barricade. But more soldiers trotted forward, guns raised. Amaya was at his side in an instant, leveling her own Henry rifle. "Cover me," she mouthed. John crouched beneath an outcropping of rock. Bullets splintered the wood, thumping into snow inches above his head. The wind ripped his scarf free and twisted it into a hank around a nearby tree. He yanked it back, tied it to the butt of his rifle, and peered over the wind-tossed mound. Through the roaring gale, John saw Laurent Duval himself, astride a white stallion, sweeping the clearing with a field glass. His face was a mask of pale fury, lips curled in a snarl. He spotted John's rifle barrel half buried in snow and slammed a fist against the glass. The stallion reared. Duval raised his own carbine and fired. The shot rang out deafening in the howl of wind. John ducked, but felt a searing strike across his left shoulder. The bullet shattered the bone, sending a fierce bolt of agony down his arm. He gasped, dropping the rifle, and rolled away. Amaya's cry cut through the storm. She dropped the torch and scrambled to his side, dragging him behind the fallen trunk. Blood bloomed through his coat, dark and crimson, in the thin glow of flame. He gritted his teeth against waves of pain that threatened to pull him under. She ripped off her scarf, pressed it against the wound, and shaking. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice fierce in the gale. "I won't lose you." He stared at her, thunderstruck by her strength, as the wind tore at her dark hair, whipping it around her face. Grit and snow had flecked her cheeks. Her eyes blazed like coals. He reached out, brushing fingers against her cheek. "You saved me," he rasped. "Now let me return the favor." He shifted, trying to lift his rifle, but his arm was useless. Amaya glanced back toward the burning barricade. The soldiers had regrouped, dismounted, and advanced through the forest like wolves stalking a wounded stag. "We need a new plan," she said, voice steady, despite the pounding of horses' hooves and rifle cracks in the distance. She tightened the bandage, wincing at his grunt. "Follow me. There's a cave entrance not far off." He swallowed bile, but nodded. With her help, he hobbled to his feet, one arm slung across her shoulder. Dusty bounded to their side, pressing them forward, barking at anyone who came too close. They moved between trees blackened red by old fires, each step an ordeal for John. His breaths came in rattling gasps, each one sharper than the last. Still, he refused to collapse. Every drop of his blood matched the forest's ancient stains. He would not give up. The cave mouth yawned beneath a ridge dotted with boulders. Inside, the wind's roar was muffled, replaced by a dripping echo. Amaya guided him to a dry nook, where she laid him down gently. Then she produced a small satchel of salves and linen's relics from her grandmother's medicine bundle. She cleaned the wound with whiskey using an old bone needle to cut away a fragment of jagged buckshot still embedded in his flesh. He clenched his jaw as she worked the torchlight, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Dusty whined, nosing closer. "Hold still," Amaya said, her voice tender now. She pressed a poultice of yarrow and moss into the wound. John's vision blurred at the edges, pain yielding to numbness. She bound it tight with strips of linen, knotting each twist with a rune, whispered in Apache, a blessing of healing. When she finished, she slipped the wolf-tooth chain from around her neck and placed it into his uninjured hand. "Your turn," she said. Confused, he shook his head. He touched the chain's cold teeth, each engraved rune stark against his palm. "What the map must burn," she interrupted, voice urgent. "It's cursed. It calls them." John sat up with effort, propping himself against the rocky wall. He stared at the small fragment of parchment lying on the dirt floor. It had been kept safe in a leather tube now torn open. The red lines gleamed in the torchlight as though pulsing with life. "It's the only way," Amaya insisted. "They hunt me because I carry half of their power. If we destroy it, the other half becomes useless." She reached for his battered hatchet. "I'll take care of it." He nodded, defeated but trusting. She held the fragment to the flame, watched the edges curl black. A hissing sound, then small curls of ash. John felt the forest shudder, the wind's fury amplify. They both stepped back as the map disintegrated in the flame's kiss, then scattered into ash on the cave floor. In that moment, the wind outside fell silent. No hoofbeats, no rifle reports, just a heavy hush, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Amaya and John stared at each other, wonder and fear mingling in their eyes. Then, far off, a single shot rang out. Not aimed at them, but echoing through the woods like a distant signal. John stood unsteadily. "They're gone." Amaya slipped the medallion of wolf's teeth back around her neck. "They will be," she whispered. "They have no reason now to stay." He grunted in pain, then smiled faintly. "We have reason to move." He touched her arm. "Let's finish this." They emerged from the cave into a forest washed in the pale glare of moonlight. Snow still falling in gentle flakes. The burned barricade lay smoldering, but no bodies remained. Duval's men had withdrawn, hauling their wounded back toward the road. John took a favoring breath of the cold air, felt it burn his lungs. Pain still throbbed in his shoulder, but he inhaled strength from the world around him. The trees, though vast and battered, stood resolute like him. They pressed deeper into the bloodwood, guided by Amaya's memory, and the wolf-tooth chain's runes, each symbol aligning with natural landmarks: an uprooted stump, a pool frozen into glass, a bent pine whose branches formed an arch. At each sign, Amaya touched the chain, whispering prayers in her mother's tongue. John watched, fascinated by the way she melded the physical with the mystical blending Apache tradition, with the gritty reality of survival. In her presence, he understood that this journey was more than gold or land. It was the reclamation of identity, of history, scrawled upon the bones of ancestors. By midnight, they reached a narrow ravine where granite walls rose sheer on either side. The snow laid smooth across the stones, but Amaya's keen eyes spotted the entrance to an old mine shaft hidden behind drifts and lichen. She led him to a rusted iron ring set low in the rock, a sealed door. The wolf teeth in her necklace fit into small notches carved into the stone. She removed the chain and placed each tooth in order. With a rumble deep in the earth, the panel slid open, revealing steps descending into darkness. John gripped his rifle with his free hand and took Amaya's arm. Together they entered the shaft, the air damp and heavy. Their lantern cast long shadows as they descended each footfall, stirring centuries of dust. The walls glowed with veins of silver ore, streaked with rust, that looked like spilled blood. At the bottom lay a vault door, no larger than a man's shoulder, sealed with iron bands. It bore the same flaming ring symbol carved above the oak where John had first found Amaya. She laid her palm on the cold metal and spoke words in Apache, invoking the protection of her ancestors. The seal clicked. The door swung open on creaking hinges, revealing a small chamber lined with wooden crates and leather sacks. Inside were ingots of silver stamped with the marks of the old tribal smiths, artifacts meant to secure her people's future, not to line the pockets of exploiters. A folded parchment lay atop a chest, a deed bearing the signature of the U.S. Surveyor General and the mark of Chief Broken Wind Amaya's grandfather. It granted title to the Iron Mountains land for the Apache band. Tears filled Amaya's eyes as she touched the document. John stood behind her, heart swelling. He watched her rise, then holding the deed aloft, as though offering it to the roof of the rocky vault. In that instant, he understood the true power they'd fought to reclaim. It was not silver for its own sake, but justice, acknowledgement of wrongs, committed restoration of a birthright. The air in the shaft seemed to hum, the veins of ore glinting with promise. Amaya turned to him, eyes shining. "We've done it, John." Her voice trembled with relief. "It's over." He stepped forward to embrace her, mindful of his wounded shoulder. "No," he whispered. "It's only beginning." As they ascended the steps, lantern swinging, he felt the storm outside abating, less wind, fewer flakes drifting. The forest beyond seemed to stand taller, prouder, as though the land itself rejoiced. Dusty padded ahead, sniffing, then looked back with bright eyes, tail wagging. Together they emerged into a world made new by fire and struggle. The night sky was clear, the stars sharp points of light. John placed a steady hand on Amaya's shoulder. "Let's take it to the agents," he said. "That deed belongs in the courthouse." Amaya nodded, determination rekindled in her gaze. "And then I go home." He offered his arm, and she took it. Their shadows long across the crisp snow. Behind them, the burning barricade lay smoldering in the distance. Ahead, the path to justice and to healing stretched out beneath the starlight. In the hush of the forest, the words she'd whispered so many nights ago found their echo in his heart. "The fire is not our enemy. It is our promise." and together they walked toward the promise fulfilled, leaving behind only footprints in the white and the quiet memory of flames that had guarded them through the storm of the bloodwood. A month passed like a slow breath over the high desert, the harsh winter thawing into a pale spring that seeped through every crack of John Rourke's cabin. The world beyond his threshold, once swept by snow and haunted by the howls of storms, now whispered with dripping drips of melting icicles and bird calls that echoed among the red-streaked pines. In that time, Amaya's deed and the chain of wolf's teeth had become the fulcrum of a legal drama that drew no small measure of attention. Territorial agents rode in from Cheyenne with crisp uniforms and clipped manner, their tongues sharpened by anxieties over precedent and property rights. They sat at John's rough-hewn table under flickering lantern light, unrolled the parchment that bore the Surveyor General's signature and the proud mark of Chief Broken Wind, and studied it with grave respect. Amaya stood beside John as they explained the document's authority, its grant of land in perpetuity to the Apache band of the Iron Mountains. Faces that had once regarded her with suspicion now bowed in apology. The county clerk's pen scratched across the pages of the official record, transcribing each word of the deed. Outside the people of Dusty's Hollow, those brave enough to shield Amaya from Laurent Duval's hired guns gathered beneath the budding cottonwoods for the public reading. The sheriff, cheeks reddened by wind and regret, offered a solemn apology on the courthouse steps. In law, we sought to uphold the interests of capital, but in justice, we see the truth of this child's birthright. The townsfolk murmured assent, heads bent in shame and relief. Amaya, the once silent girl, who had spoken no English upon her rescue, now stood proud in buckskins, pressed and cleaned by Redbird's wife, her voice clear as the spring sky. She thanked them for their courage and forgiveness, each word thrown out into the hush like a benediction. When the final flourish was set, and the deed declared recorded, Amaya and John stepped out beneath the late afternoon sun, lungs filling with the scent of sagebrush and pine resin. The canyon walls glowed amber as light filtered through the new leaves. Hands tucked into her pockets, Amaya turned to John, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath. She spoke of her people's past, of camps in New Mexico, where she had been branded 47B, where her voice had nearly been broken by whips and hunger. Now she spoke to reclaim it, to announce that the wolf's teeth talisman, the burned map fragments, the scars upon her back, had led to this moment of restitution. John listened as though each syllable were a note in a song he had only begun to learn, his heart swelling with awe and pride. That evening they returned to the cabin, where Dusty waited by the fire tail, thumping against the hearth's stone floor. John lit a fresh log, and they sat before it with mugs of hot tea sweetened by homemade honey. The wolf-tooth chain lay coiled between them, a silent testament to trials and triumph. Amaya traced each silver fang with her fingertips, recounting the story behind every inscription. One for life, one for death, one for memory, one for vengeance, and the last for hope. John watched the firelight play upon her face, now healed at peace, filled with a quiet radiance. He realized then that their bond was not forged merely by shared danger, but by a deeper alchemy, the intertwining of two souls seeking redemption, each for wounds that ran far deeper than skin. Days passed in a rhythm of healing. John showed Amaya how to mend his saddlebags, how to read the weather in cloud banks, how to coax water from a deep spring. She, in turn, taught him words in Apache phrases to bless the horses, words to call the wind secrets of the land that only those born to its rhythms could know. Under her instruction, He learned to listen to the quiet hum of tobacco rippling across a leaf, to the pulse of streams flowing beneath ice. And Amaya learned to trust again, to laugh at Dusty's antics, to place her confidence in a man who once battled his own demons and found in her a chance to atone. But even as the cabin filled with warmth and laughter, Amaya's restlessness grew. Each dawn she greeted the rising sun with a solemn nod, as though acknowledging a covenant, a promise that could not remain confined to 4 log walls and a hearth. One morning, after they had broken camp and the horses were saddled for a ride beyond the canyon rim, she turned to John beneath the watchful gaze of the Iron Mountains. "My people await me," she said softly, voice carrying the weight of duty and longing. "I must return to walk the land my grandfather led to live among our tribe, to rebuild what was lost." John felt a hollow ache at her words. He had grown accustomed to her presence, the calm force that grounded his restless spirit, and the thought of the cabin's empty bunks left a bitter tang. Yet he knew she spoke truth. The deed recorded. The land returned. The legacy entrusted. Her path lay eastward toward the high mesas, where the Iron Mountains gave way to sun-baked plains. "I'll ride with you as far as the river crossing," he offered heart. Heavy. "Then I'll turn back." Amaya nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, not for fear or sorrow, but for the gravity of departure and the gratitude for a companion who had seen her through darkness. On the morning of their parting, Dusty trotted ahead down the trail, leading out of Dusty's hollow sunlight glancing off his grizzled muzzle. John and Amaya rode side by side, the red pines thinning into juniper and sagebrush. For miles they spoke in low voices of hopes that soon the Apache children would learn the history reclaimed by the chain and the parchment of a dream where Amaya's people farmed the valley's irrigation channels, and of a promise that she would return each season to renew the friendship between clans. At the river's ford, a broad ribbon of clear water skirting smooth stones, Amaya reined in her mount. The crossing was shallow here, but swift. Beyond it lay open prairie and the trading post where wagons bound for Santa Fe rested before continuing east. They dismounted. John walked Amaya's horse down to the shallows and tested the footing with one boot. When he looked back, she stood astride her horse silhouette, carved against a wall of distant cliffs. She reached into her satchel and drew forth the leather pouch that had once held the map fragment. Inside lay the wolf-tooth chain, gleaming quietly. With a steady hand, she placed it around John's neck. It settled against his chest, each tooth cool and familiar. "When the wind howls through the pines," she said, "think of me." He patted the chain and held her gaze. "And I'll think of you," he replied, "every time I watch the sun rise over these mountains." They embraced briefly, fiercely. Two souls bound by trials and triumphs. Amaya slid from her mount and stood on the riverbank, eyes bright, as she raised her hand in farewell. John tightened the reins in one hand and lifted his hat with the other, whispering a blessing in Apache that Redbird had taught him. "May the Great Spirit ride with you." Then, as Amaya guided her horse across the flowing water, John turned in the opposite direction, following Dusty's bark back toward the forested slopes he called home. The road back to the cabin was quiet, but not empty. Memories trailed him like whispers. Amaya's first worded plea for protection, her rifle's crack in defense of his life, the trembling flame that had burned the cursed map, the echo of her voice as she read the deed to the gathered townsfolk, the warmth of her laughter when Dusty leapt into his lap. He patted the wolf-tooth chain beneath his coat and felt a surge of peace. The journey had changed them both, and he carried now not only the scars of battle, but the promise of healing. Back at the cabin, John pushed open the door to find Dusty asleep by the hearth, a fresh bed of pine boughs awaiting him. He fed the dog a chunk of dried venison, then removed the wolf-tooth chain and draped it across a wooden peg by the entrance, an offering to the land that had given them refuge. Into the hearth, he tossed a log, stoked the flames, and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the crackle of burning sap. That night, as wind whispered through the chinks in the logs and the stars wheeled overhead, there came a tapping at the door. John rose, hand on his Colt's grip, and swung it open to find a small leather pouch resting on the threshold. Inside lay a single bone pendant carved with the image of two figures beneath a blazing sun. On the back, scratched in delicate script, were the words, "I never had a father. If I could choose one, I would choose you." He stood in the snow, heart pounding, holding that tiny token. No name accompanied it, no further message, only the promise of return. John closed the door against the chill and held the pendant to his chest as Dusty pressed against his legs, nuzzling his hand. He knelt, eyes damp in the lantern's glow, and whispered into the hush, "I choose you too, Amaya." Outside, the forest lay silent and red at its base, its sap long since settled into the earth. But in the heart of those towering pines beneath the arch of sky, a promise lingered, bound by fire and blood, guided by faith and courage. And as John Rourke settled by the fire with Dusty at his heel, he knew that no matter how far Amaya roamed, the bond they had forged would outlast any storm, any distance, until at last they rode together again beneath the rising sun.